Hello, you are very welcome to the Attic Sessions, and we are on the road again with the Attic because we are down in the very beautiful surroundings of Dromineer, County Tipperary on Lough Derg, because we're attending the 14th annual Dromineer Literary Festival.
Have held me in your arms, in my head. I've been witness.
So I'm joined by an award-winning poet and fiction writer who has published to date 10 books of prose and poetry, and has written 5 books of poetry, the most recent being The Windows of Graceland, New and Selected Poems, which was published by Carcanet in 2016. And her previous collection, Burnfort Las Vegas, was shortlisted for the Irish Times Poetry Now Award, and she won the 2011 Premio Chiampi International Prize. Am I saying that right? Premio
Something
Chiampi?
like Piero Ciampi.
A great prize, one way or the other. So Martina Evans, lovely to meet you.
Yeah.
And in such a beautiful place, the lake is just over there. What brings you to Dromineer?
Well, I've been invited by Eleanor Hooker, who's a wonderful poet herself, and the amazing organiser and brain behind this festival. Met her in Cork, and actually she came to my workshop. It was a 4 masters workshop at the Cork Literary Festival, and Eleanor was in it, and afterwards I got an invitation to Dromineer, so it was great. And she's a pretty wonderful person, actually.
And you don't know this part of the world at all? You haven't?
Never been here.
Yeah.
So it's been stunning to
well, it will be stunning by the time you get a chance to actually see the lake, because you were kind of grabbed in here and plonked in front of a camera. So you will discover the beauty of that lake over there. But you actually only grew up, what, 40 miles down the road, Malone?
Is it only 40 miles to Malone?
Yeah, roughly down, if you go cross country-ish.
God, I didn't realise. So yeah, not far away at all, so Munster.
Yeah. In a place called Burnfort.
Burnfort.
So tell us, how would we find Burnfort and what's there? And
very bad sense of direction. I can only go there in my dreams, which I think poems are kind of dreams. No, seriously. It's between Mallow and Cork, and it's in the back road. But I think probably that's one of the impulses, apart from the fact that childhood is a very rich period for any poet. That world has vanished. Because it was, the bar shop and petrol pumps, and there was a post office.
And is that even there now?
Yeah, the post office is gone.
Yeah.
And I suppose most people will probably go to Mallow, to Tesco's or whatever. So it's kind of bypassed. And at one stage it was the road to Mallow and Cork. I think there was a saying, as bent as the Mallow Road, there used to be a saying. And then there was a main road, but I think the main road was too many bends, so then they made another main road.
And you, because I know you've written about sort of being in this shop, post office, petrol station.
The post office was up the road. I had a real fantasy about the post office. I wanted to be a postmistress, because it was the cutest little building with everything in green. And in fact, that's influenced the book we're going to talk about later, the book that's coming out next year. I always loved this idea about green post boxes and red post boxes, and the fact that the green ones had once been red, and the same with the buses. But I had an obsession with the post office, the licking of the stamps and the melting the wax. And the woman who lived there was, she was really gentle, lovely woman, Mrs. O'Connell. And I used to love going up there, and her sweets always seemed to smell nicer. She had a smaller, just a few sweets and stuff, but they seemed more magical.
I think flavours of the past somehow always seem...
No, but what I mean is we had sweets as well. We had like pop shop and petrol pumps. I'm just saying, it's usually, like the grass is greener. Her sweets seem to smell sweeter. That shop seemed to smell sweeter than ours.
Okay, but you had people coming in?
Oh, it was just constantly coming. And my family used to live in Australia, and we had lots of visitors from Australia and America. Even somebody in Australia might give them our address, and people that they wouldn't know from Adam would turn up with knapsacks.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know if I should say this, but I remember sometime in the 90s, somebody said, somebody's coming from Australia. My mother got into her car and drove off and knocked at the door because she got tired of visitors. But it was very, very exciting because my eldest brother, who I get on really well with, he's the other big reader in the family. He's 21 years older than me, and he stayed in Australia when they left Australia.
Because there were 10. There were 10 kids in your family.
They started on a farm in Patrick's Well, and they left with 5 kids in 1950.
Yeah.
Sold the farm, went to Australia, lived there for 10 years, had 4 more children, and then came back and had me. But they had left the eldest 2 behind, so I didn't see them until the late 60s.
Okay.
And actually bonded really well with both of them, Eric and Betty.
So
God, I mean, you could just go on a bit forever because there's just so many.
But one of the
adventures.
things I was wondering about, because you've been describing this shop where people come in and it's almost like you're on display. I think you read a poem last night, facing the public.
And so it's a bit like that as well, yeah.
But is that where you got the interest in voices, in the dramatic monologue, in character? Do you think that's where it started?
Yes and no. I think it was a fertile ground for it, but I think it ran in the family anyway. My mother was an O'Shaughnessy, and I think all that family were amazing. And her youngest sister, Auntie Helen, was amazing and apparently loved acting in her youth, and she was the funniest aunt. I used to just love visiting her, but actually she had a shop in County Limerick, and their mother had a shop.
Yeah.
But I think that's the way they were very dramatic storytelling. And I think that's quite an Irish thing.
Yeah, that tradition of the oral.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, I was talking to Martin Doyle a bit about our panel session tonight, and I was thinking about short stories, and it reminded me there's a wonderful introduction to the Mary Lavin Collected Stories by V.S. Pritchard, talking about the Irish character and short stories, and he talks about Irish people being dramatic. And he talks about 2 things going on, about the Irish being able to quickly tell a story in a dramatic way, but it's a veil for something else going on underneath. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's the best kind of poem or storytelling. It's ostensibly about one thing, but there's something else going on
underneath. There's an undercurrent.
Going underneath.
Yeah.
And he said the Irish were double vision, he called it.
Yeah, because that's a very dramatic thing, isn't it? That plays exist on subtext.
And even the person talking doesn't even know the subtext.
Yeah.
Because we don't know. And also I'm very interested in the idea about where voices come from. I was talking last night about my mother grew up, my father was in the War of Independence and the Civil War, he never spoke about it.
Yeah.
My mother was 17 years younger than him, was growing up in the 20s and heard all the stories, and she imbibed them all. She was fascinated with history.
Yeah.
So all that material was being gathered in the 20s that I'm now using, that I used in 2009, so long before they went to Burncourt or anything.
Sure.
So my mother was gathering stories, not consciously gathering, just fascinated in voices and listening, and she told them to me. And there's one story in particular that I remember when she told it to me, and I thought she was ventriloquizing someone else.
Yeah.
Because it was like a tale of revenge, and my mother wouldn't have been like that. It was like somebody had told a story that she heard from somebody, and she had taken it in, and she was acting out that voice.
Yeah.
Because she was saying they all knew about him.
Yeah.
His head was inside the window. So she was repeating what someone else said.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember feeling that was really eerie.
Yeah.
And then when I wrote that dramatic monologue, I was trying to capture the voice that she must have taken in.
Well,
and I'm always struck by that Lee Wash's, the Ars Poetica poem where he talks about the house of poetry is always open and guests come in and out at will.
Yeah.
My Google brain doesn't bother holding on because I can Google it in a second. You know the one?
Yes.
And the older I get, the more I realise voices are coming in and out, and we're not one person like we like to think about. We're quite collective.
Uh-huh.
And I read Jung a lot when I was in my 30s, and I loved that whole idea of tapping into the collective.
So you trained in medicine, you were a radiographer for how long?
Like paramedic, sorry, just because some people calling me a radiologist, and that means like I'm a big shot consultant, so I have to say no, I'm not. I was started in 81 and trained, and I left in 96.
So were the poems happening then as well, or?
They happened. I always wanted to write, but I also grew up in a family that were incredibly good with talking, but none of them would have ever dreamed of being writers. And like my sister did medicine, even like I wanted to do English and they frowned on that, and I was pushed off to do radiography. And bizarrely, I think the talent of the whole family is with words. But they're all they all have really good jobs. Their nieces and nephews now as computers and lawyers and medicine and all that kind of thing. But so this talking thing, I forget what question you asked. I suddenly
So you got the medical career beginning, but I'm wondering whether the
so
poems
I went in because
are...
I had to. So the poetry thing is very interesting. So I wanted to write. I wrote as a child. I put it away. Then I had diaries. I burnt them all. I was talking to that Eleanor because she also wanted to study English at UCC, but ended up training as a nurse and destroying everything.
Yeah.
But the urge was stronger and stronger, but there wasn't that permission. It was like, who the hell do you think you are? So I did the OU thinking I'd be a teacher and I'd have holidays, because the big thing is reading books. And they're two sides of the same coin. Yeah. I'm passionate about reading, because I didn't do any workshops or courses or degrees in creative writing.
So who were the first poets that you remember kind of making a big impact on you?
Well, my sister from New York was in New York as a nurse, and there's few. There was an old set of books up in the sitting room, which was upstairs in Burnford, and they'd come from Australia, and my brother Eric had been given them by a priest in the secondary school he would have gone to in Australia. And he's a lot of very good things to say about priests and nuns, which I think is about time, despite all their faults. Yeah. He said they really took care of the family because they weren't ready for immigration. They'd gone from a big farm and security, and they didn't know, they were a bit lost there. And this priest gave them, it was like about 12 volumes of Irish literature, and they were green with gold harps. And I used to love them. I learned to read very, very young myself.
Yeah.
I'm an autodidact from the beginning. Everything's done myself. And I used to find the pages where there was a lot of space, where there was a poem, and I'd get excited. And so Yeats was in there, and Up the Airy Mountain, which is a brilliant poem. So I was into the Irish poems I used to find in there, and Pádraig Colum, but my sister brought me books from America, and I think because the other poets I love are American.
Yeah, because you mentioned Frank O'Hara last night. So.
Yeah, Frank wasn't in it, but this book had Emily Dickinson, The Little Wheelbarrow, Langston Hughes.
Oh, Langston Hughes, yeah.
So Langston Hughes, William Carlos Williams, Emily Williams, Walt Whitman, gorgeous, big, richly illustrated children's book. Bits of Shakespeare, The Plums in the Plum Box, you know, that William Carlos.
Yeah.
So that book was a huge influence, and Emily Dickinson was in there, and I've always loved her. And I'm going a bit blank now because there are more in there, but I can't.
But so
early on, but I never thought I'd write poems ever, but always loved them, and always thought maybe someday I could write stories. And
so what was the point that made you actually say, right?
So I did Open University, but I soon realised money was always short, and I was doing the OU, working as a radiographer, being on call, and it was really hard, the studying, especially when I was doing the last year, because I'd done the CAT scan in the Martyr, and when I went to the hospital in London, there was only 3 of us could do CAT scan. And so that meant I was on call 1 and 3, that was carrying a bleep and getting up in the middle of the night and trying to do OU. And I thought, how's this going to go? My father died, and that was the catalyst. I'd been reading loads of poems and listening to them, and I thought I was going to write fiction, but it was poetry came out. And I went to a class, a kind of a group. It wasn't a proper class, it was the only one I ever went to. It wasn't a workshop. I'd never be able to write in a class or anything like that. And she said, she told me to go to the South Bank and look at the magazines. And I found one called Celtic Dawn. It was very glossy, and I didn't know it was run out of the Bee Gees castle. And the man was a kind of a magic person.
Oh, okay.
And he ran the magazine with Robin Gibb's wife. And I wrote a poem called There's a Snake in My Bed. and he published it and invited me down to the Bee Gees Castle, and I met Robin Gibb.
My God.
That was my first poem.
It sounds like a late 20th century version of like Yeats and the Theosophists, like, you know, it's
it
that magical thing.
They were into So anyway, Celtic Dawn, and then after that it was the more normal poetry magazines, not rock and roll or anything.
So you were reading the magazines and then submitting to the magazines.
And then and the second person then probably who published me was Maura McEntee. And my mother was impressed with that.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
But she wasn't always impressed with that, because I've written an article for the Irish Times, because when I first rang her up and said I was publishing a book, she said, "Oh, a book?" And I said, "Yeah, a book of poems." And she said, "Oh, poetry." I thought it was a book. But Maura McEntee did impress her. So then that happened, and I thought I had a baby, and radiography. I've always thought that radiography and poetry would be a fantastic job, great human interest, great things to see. But my husband wasn't able to help with the childcare at that time, and I really hated having to put her into care.
Sure.
Sorry, that sounds childcare.
Childcare.
So that gave me the impetus, and I didn't go into any classes. I just wrote in the evenings, and I got an agent and a publisher, and I did 2-book deal with Reed, who were about to become Random House, Sinclair Stevenson, which was about to come Shatter in 1994. And at that time I had a part-time job at the Whittington, and I was working in Pentonville Prison as a radiographer. Bloomsbury published the 3rd novel, but at that stage I was beginning to really crave the poetry, and the agent and the publisher wanted more books. And then I went, the Irish Post, I covered. In those years I used to feel so ignorant, because I came out of radiography, so I had no actual confidence, because I had 5 books published before I started teaching, and I was like, I can't explain what I do to anyone, but I had to learn. So my teaching was my university. That was my MA, was learning how to do it.
So
the interview, I had to cover an academic conference, and that would send me into a spin, because I was thinking, what the hell do I know about this? And I went down, and there was Christine Keneally. I just thought she was amazing, talking about the famine. And the other one was someone who became a great friend. And my book will be next book will be dedicated to her, Louise Ryan. And she did a whole thing on Republican women. And that just absolutely inspired me, because on my father's side, my mother had been in prison during the time of the Land Leagues. They were orphans. They were all in their 20s, the family, and the sisters decided to do the plan of campaign, where they board up and pour the Indian meal in the hot water.
So this was in Limerick?
In Limerick, in 1881, I think.
Yeah.
She was born in 1865.
Yeah.
So she'd gone to prison. There's loads of stories about her. I never got around to writing about her. And she'd run a safe house, and they'd been in the IRA, so I was very interested in the women. And I got really inspired, and Louise and I became great friends, and she told me where to go when I did the research. But I was beginning to get really bored and tired with the novels, and I did a pile of research, too much research. There was a lot going on in my life, and also I couldn't get into, because my whole thing is getting into the voice, the negative capability, and I just couldn't get into their heads. I couldn't imagine myself, because we've seen the end product.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine that idealism.
Yeah.
So what happened was I did all the research, loads and loads. I went back, I remember my mother's story, and it all stalled, and I put it to one side. And then next thing I was going through divorce, and I became conscious of children caught up in crossfire. Unconsciously.
Yeah.
And my father had been hostage to the Black and Tans. My mother had been picked up by the Black and Tans. At the time, Israeli soldiers were using Palestinian boys as shields.
Yeah.
There was the story of the boy from Doris. And I suddenly thought, this is what happened. I was researching that, but this is what I should write about.
Yeah.
And Facing the Public was a great move forward, and I left fiction behind. I thought, this is like flying. I'm so sick of fiction.
Yeah.
And then I had a novel called Petrol, and my agent, I promised her I'd sort it out, and I suddenly found myself turning it into prose poems. And wanting that voice, wanting the intensity, wanting to cut down. And then those Republican women, I never forgot them. And there was older women, you see, and by now the years were passing and I was the age of the older women. And one summer, because it came this thing, I have a bad back and I was in a car accident when I was 26, so I've always have neck problems and stuff. I think it's the other reason I don't like novels. You can write a poem in any position. Novel is always like work.
You're over the
and you're tied. There's a great freedom of, you're tied to the plot. It's very ploddy. So I think Petrol is a novel, but it's like doing something different with it. Not being linear, because when I did it, I cut it all up and then had a whole load of little squares and I shuffled them like tarot cards. I like the idea of not being linear as well. So I thought, oh, I could rewrite that story from the middle-aged women point of view, worried about the young women, because now I'm a middle-aged woman worried about my young daughter, and I could imagine being in the mind of the older women worried about, God, this is mad what they're doing. Because they must have been so rebellious and new to the older women. So I thought, oh, they'd probably write letters to each other. So I went down to the bottom of my garden of a hammock that summer from teaching and wrote a load of letters to each other. And that was the freedom from the novel. I hate this being tied, that you have to go right, you have to go left 10,000 words in and right, and you have to
you can segue in all sorts of directions.
So I did big bundles of letters. They were written on cards, index cards, green and pink. And then I had a box and I decorated it with loads of shamrocks and it was red and green. And because I had this thing about red and green always. But I didn't want to call it the green and red because Iris Murdoch had that. And then I wanted to call it the green book and the red book, but Murakami has a green book and a red book. So when I had a box of letters. And then about a year later, because I've always loads of books on the go, because Petrol was coming out at this time and I often sit on them a while. Because now I realise often time is the best editor, and I do most of the correcting myself. So I know if I leave them long enough, I'll be able to see
you'll
them.
have the objectivity.
So I took the letters out of the box again, and I thought, they seem old-fashioned. Because in a way, you're always writing to the now. We're never really writing like they wrote back. We're always writing from now. So I thought, okay, I'll put them into prose poems, but the prose poems of Petrol, I'm bored with prose poems now. There's too many of them and I'm sick of it because it was thrilling at the time. I have to be feeling I'm doing something exciting. So then I got rid of the Dear Miss This and Goodbye Mrs. and Yours Sincerely and all the rest and turned them into blocks, but I still wasn't happy. And when I got divorced, my mother's a big influence on me, like hugely. Like I think I'm haunted by her. Like I really feel I'm a haunted house. And when I got divorced, I thought she'd be really disapproving. And I'll always remember she was not at the beginning, before the others got to her. There's a lot of people were whispering into her ear. So, I mean, that's how people do it. But at the beginning, she was incredibly sympathetic, and that's something I kind of carry in myself, which was wonderful. And everybody was in the kitchen. She was there with her friends and cronies, and she said, now, Martina is divorced, and we're all widows here. Now we can talk openly about men. And I never forgot that line. And as usual, when
all of these Republican women were widows now, or many.
Oh, they weren't Republican at all. They were just local women.
Yeah.
She was just saying, now we can talk openly about men. But the wind, like in any, if you're being over dramatic, the wind can often be taken out of your sails. Because my sister-in-law was in the corner, so actually there was one non-widow who's married to my brother. Yeah. And then she saw, oh, sorry, May is there. So then she couldn't. That kind of took. But I never forgot the line. And I was thinking about a title because I couldn't have the green and the red because of Iris Murdoch, and I couldn't have the green book and the red book because of Murakami. And then I thought, now we can talk openly about men. And then I thought, that's 10 syllables. My mother was very dramatic. Yeah. I'm convinced she was always kind of moving in and out of iambic pentameter. I thought, right, that's it. So back I went and converted the whole book into 10-syllable lines, and it's called Now We Can Talk Openly About Men. It'll be published by Carcanet, and everything got squashed again. So it went from 250,000 of novel down to about 22,000, and it's now down to 10,000, because once you change the form, once you take it out, because if I didn't like a poem maybe 8 years ago, I would take it out of lines and put it into prose poetry, and that would reduce it. But now prose poetry, I have to get it back out of prose poetry as a way of editing, and when I put it back into the 10-syllable lines, it's really slimmed down, and I feel now it's finally concentrated and done after 20 years.
So what are you working on now, Martina?
I'm working on a series of poems that started with, I think that's interesting about writing, it's kind of self-mining, and you start with a little seed. And I'm always obsessed with my mother and remembering her, and I think I said earlier, I'm like a haunted house. There was a special day she used to often talk about in 1972 where we went to Clonakilty and had a day together. I think it's my equivalent actually of that Heaney poem when all the others were away at Mass. The two of us went to Clonakilty and bought shoes together while my sister was doing her entrance exam for secondary school. And she used to talk about it. And I wrote a sonnet, because again, that I think one of the catalysts can be form. So when I first discovered prose poetry, that was exciting. Now it's become boring, and writing a sonnet was exciting. And then I found I kept writing more sonnets about shoes, and then more poems, free verse poems about shoes, feet, X-ray, and there must be about 25 now. And all of a sudden, after 20 years, I've left X-ray, 21 years since I left the X-ray department. My 15 years in the NHS and the Southern Health Board and the Eastern Health Board are just flooding back into my poems. So,
and you read one last night at the Nina Art Centre for the opening event of the Dromineer Festival. So you're going to read that for us, or recite it for us now.
So it's Nighttown. It's a working title because it starts in the Mater Hospital around 1984, which was in Eccles Street, where Leopold Bloom, my favourite literary character, lived. But I suppose Nighttown, I'm worried about the kind of brothel associations that people might think this is about sex with, because it's got expanding feet, and people might read terrible things into it, because it's, what can I do? So I might have to change that. But Nighttown, I'm thinking of dreams, and I think dreams are very important to my writing at the moment, dreamlike, and maybe that's what's attracting me back to radiography, because if you do 24 hours, we used to do 24-hour stints, I think they do shifts now, and you do enter a kind of dream world when you're up that long. So, Nighttown. Up all night in the Mater Hospital, pushing an X-ray machine through fluorescent light. I'd waited 8 hours for the last coronary bypass, and when it came back, I'd given up and gone to bed. So I had to come down again in the old cage lift from the doctor's res, to the heart arrested in ITU, the body bucking. The surgeon from Dubai shoving me to one side as I centred the X-ray tube and my cross of light on the sunken sternum. His neat brown fingers cutting into the picture, he chopped the stitches open with the side of his hand, took out the heart and massaged it in front of me while I heaved in my open-toe, forbidden sandals. I'd stopped wearing shoes after my first 24 hours in Cork Regional. They rang from casualty. RTA, get up out of that quick. The porter who'd memorised the whole of the Yangtze River menu shouted there was 2 stretchers coming up from a road traffic accident. I sat on the side of the narrow bed, felt for my shoes. Only my feet were tender watermelons now that refused to go in. Forcing them, I couldn't take one step, like an ugly sister or a stepmother in hot iron shoes. I hoped bare feet wouldn't be noticed in an emergency. Oh, as a gypsy you are now, so the A&E sister snapped out of her blue lead apron as I padded around the immobilised blood and alcohol-smelling body with my sandbags and cassettes, marking right and left with my metal markers, concentrating on not mixing them up like I had the last time. That bossy sister noticed everything I did. I woke next day in the stuffy on-call room at 4:30. My day off already disappeared into November darkness as I hurried to the shoe shop at Wilton Shopping Centre. The assistant told me that feet never stopped growing. Half a size for every year, I'm telling you, girl. Sleepy and bewildered, I purchased a big size 7. And it was only when I revived over beans and toast at 8 o'clock that it hit me. By that reasoning, my feet would be size 30 at the age of 40, with many yards to go ahead of me. The coffin that would hold me hasn't been built yet, I shouted into the empty beige kitchen. Next day, back in the shop for an exchange, no sign of the first assistant. The older beehived woman said she'd never heard of her.
So thank you very much, Martina, for talking to us, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
I will.
So we're joined by Eleanor Hooker, who is the reason we're here. She has kindly invited us down to capture the magic of the Dromineer Festival. And it's 14 years now.
Yeah.
Eleanor. How can that be?
It flew past. We had our first meeting in the Whiskey Still, the village pub. I made the first minutes on a beer mat, and because I had no paper, I just kept going round in circles, and I still have it. And people say you're a hoarder, and I think, no, I'm an archivist. But
why did you want to bring a festival here?
The Arts Office and Nina were looking for a literary festival in North Tipperary, as we were then, and they just sent out feelers.
Yeah.
And Tom O'Donoghue, I met him in the village, and you know, we're all crouched down in the winter because the sky is so low and it's just so miserable, and we thought we'd lift the place a bit with a literary festival. Tom has since died, and he was one of our founding members. And he just said, would you like to be involved? And I said, yes, please. So I wrote to everybody. Seamus Heaney wrote 2 lovely letters. Maeve Binchy said, I'm a bit ill, I'm not dying or anything, but I'd love to come down, but maybe another time. And she talked all about her fond memories on the lake. Yeah. So you'd issue an invitation, and you'd get these gorgeous letters back. There was a willingness from the beginning.
Yeah.
And our core philosophy, we said from the start, is that we would have established writers beside new writers. Yeah. And everybody embraced that. Yeah. Because at the time you didn't get to see the new voices. Yeah. And like you saw at the launching party yesterday, Martina just introduced these wonderful writers and gave a beautiful and essentially a review of their new books.
Yeah. No, that was extraordinary, and it is sort of great to get the sense of the continuity of established, but the people who will be sort of the establishment, you know, in a number of decades or next year or whenever it might be. You know? But it must be really hard work, just sort of trying to do this.
Yeah, it's a full-time job, and it has to be in order to make it look as smooth as it is. There's an awful lot of work that goes under the surface. Like at the beginning of the year all the way through. And a lot of people write if they've anxiety, so you have to address every single email. You know, you can't say I'll wait a couple of days. You know, everything is well, for me it's immediate, so that people don't think they're forgotten. And we love people to within an inch of their lives, and I think people like that. There has to be a warmth. I talk to people and they say they go to festivals, they go to their hotel room, they do their reading, and then they're off the monitor, and they fall beneath the radar. We sort of say to people, you can live with us if you like. Move in, it's fine. You know,
and here's a doorknob.
Yes, here's a doorknob. Although the male artists were saying, is there something you're telling me? Went, no, it's just an ornamental drawer knob, and they said even that's dodgy. So
talk to me a little about, because when we come here and we discover the lake, we're all kind of wowed by the amazing quality. You've been living here for how long?
We came back to Ireland in 2002. Okay. But it's Peter's great-grandparents' house, so when the children were small, I'd come over for the summer on my own. We were getting it slowly restored, and the boys were sailing, so I'd come and spend the summer here with them. And then Peter...
So has that always then fed into your writing?
Yes. I've been writing all my life. I had a fit of temper when I was 21, and I shaved my head totally bald. There was a lot of things around it, and I burned everything I ever wrote. And then I had sort of every decade I just burned stuff. And I just didn't have the confidence. And I showed my poetry to Pat Kelly, who's our treasurer. Sadly he can't be here this weekend because he's had a death in his family. But I showed him my poetry, and he said, you need to not doubt about it. And I went to Michael Cody's the first workshop I ever went to was with Michael Cody. And I mean, he's a teddy bear. He was so kind.
Yeah.
And he said to me, and I didn't realise, he said, "You're extraordinary." I've never published the poem I brought to that workshop, but he said, "You're extraordinarily brave to bring this poem." And there were one or two characters, you know, in every workshop there are characters who are very, very strong. And some of them, if you show any sort of vulnerability, some people will protect you, and
others will go in for the jugular.
Absolutely, that's the thing. And he contained that workshop because he saw what was going. He said, "I'm hosting this.
Yeah.
None of you can do this."
Yeah.
And I thought, gosh, you know, because I was so divorced from the emotions that wrote the poem, I thought it's okay, you can discuss it any way you like.
Yeah.
But he thought, no, I'm your advocate now because I'm hosting it. And I thought this is something I can do.
Yeah.
You know, the world doesn't fall apart
Yeah.
if I write these kind of poems.
And the workshop is an important part of this festival because on the Saturday morning there's a poetry workshop, a fiction workshop, and I've attended them and given them and know that it is very much that ethos of people are protected.
Oh yeah.
When you
And when the workshop host provider, like the poet or they ask me what are the guidelines, and I generally say you need to mind everybody, because there are people who are local who are just dipping their toe in the water, and they're starting up, and they're amongst people who've maybe published 2 or 3 books, but they have to have the same courtesy, and the rest of the workshop. And that's from the top of the table.
Yeah.
If the person at the top of the table is showing that this person is just as has just as much right to be here as everybody else. And so it's all about protecting and encouraging new writing. At this time, we had 518 entries from the schools.
Wow. Which Geraldine Mitchell was involved in judging.
Yeah.
And she, on Friday night at the opening event, was talking about living somewhere, in her case, West Mayo, looking out the window every day at this view over to Clare Island, and I'm thinking, Eleanor's looking out every morning at a view over Lough Derg. Like, do you find something different every day? How do you sort of respond to that inspiration?
If you sit we have a little pier, a little old stone pier. If I sit on the pier, the seasons change literally every half hour. On a windy day, I will go and sit there. I'll wrap up and sit there because the sea eagles come up from Bushy Island.
Oh, yes.
And you see this yellow-hooked, yellow-clawed creature just skimming the water fishing. We don't tell anybody about it because there's anxiety that they're going to get shot or poisoned or whatever. So I sit there and I have my own nature show. We have red squirrels. The first time in years there are red squirrels on the eastern shore of Lough Derg. And the grey squirrels haven't got it. And it's a retrovirus that'll kill them. So I watch reds and I hum the music to James Bond because they kind of, that and so, that music so I hum that while I'm watching them. It's wonderful. We have pine martens. We have mink, which is unfortunate, but they're here now.
Actually, I think the theory about grey squirrel receding is that the pine martens are getting them.
Oh, right.
And they don't go for the red squirrel; they go for the grey. I've seen somewhere, so
that's interesting.
Could be linked. And I know water really features in your last collection, A Tug of Blue, which was launched last year.
Yes,
at the festival. Is there maybe a poem from there that you could read for us?
Or
anything you like.
Yeah. Well, because I'm on the lifeboat, there are 2 characters in the village. Teddy Knight, who's taking us out on the boat today, and Charles Stanley Smith, who lives in the village, who, because of their efforts, a few years ago, 3 sailors went across the lake. 2 of them decided to come back by water, and the girls said, "No, guys, it's too rough," and they lost their lives. They didn't make it back. And then Charles and Teddy said, "We need a declared resource here," and they approached the RNLI, and the RNLI said, "Absolutely, no problem." And a friend of mine, George Harriet, who used to go up and down in barges and knew he was in the Navy, everything you needed to know about water. I'd asked George. So this poem is sort of dedicated to them because it's their stories.
Lovely. Love to hear that.
Okay.
Would love to hear that.
It's a bit dark because people say at the end, goodness, the ending, but it refers to something that actually happened here.
Life.
The sheltered world. We navigate the narrow neck of darkness to find them in the gut of the night, fouled, stricken, wrecked. We return them to the sheltered world, and in returning to the sheltered world, we sept the still, our land legs hollow, but restless to put to sea restored. Cradling a carafe of light, an ancient seafarer crosses the bar to take up station beside us. He declares he's glad we're here, glad we fetched them back alive, says 'twas different in the owl times. In the owl times, he says, 'twas different. On nights such as this, they dragged a grapnel along the grey water's bed, and often as not, snagged the afterworld. Along the grey water's bed, their grapnel rent unanswered prayers, unused flares, a mother's dream as they hooked her child and brought him punctured to the surface.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
And there's so much powerful imagery in that book.
Because before the lifeboat, it was mostly recovery, and they used grapnels and anchors to get people up. And the thing is, you want people back.
Yeah.
You don't want to wait that 10 days.
Yeah.
And the lake, if it takes someone, she'll take them right down, and then 10 days later she'll surrender them.
Yeah.
But that 10 days is torturous for the family.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one can think of several instances this year of people still waiting for loved ones, and it's unfathomable, really. I think, you know. So what next? That came out last year. What's happening for you creatively now?
I'm working on my third collection, and I'm writing furiously. I don't know if they're any good or not. So it was lovely to bring work. You know, it was lovely to bring work to the workshop and think, oh yeah, affirmation again, because you do doubt. If you know, and sometimes you run up against the wall and you try to climb it, and you're like those creatures in the computer games who are climbing. I've been writing a novel for about 9 years, and it's about a character called Lizzie. And she's in short stories, she's in flash. Actually, she was in Dreamless. You judged Dreamless at the Irish Writers' Centre. She gets episodes, and she's a character I love, but she won't leave me alone. So I talked to another writer, and they said, then you need to tell her story.
Yeah.
And it's not like, I mean, she's a fictional character, so I'm going to finish that.
It's a very different discipline, because I've been trying to finish a novel myself.
Yeah, oh gosh.
It is so different to poetry. It's just, it's like the long marathon, isn't it? The long haul.
And I went to Anna McCarrick for a week just before the festival. I wrote 5 poems and a short story. I was like a mad thing. And I know I came down one day, and I'm not sure if I came down in my nightdress or my hair. I was like, oh dear, I need to go back to the room. And I was staying in Miss Morby's room, and maybe they thought, oh yeah, okay, Miss Morby's affecting her. But it was like a release.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to getting back to Lizzie and seeing if I can finish it, even if it's only for me.
Yeah. No.
But I'm listening. And also Ian Sampson is starting a creative writing PhD in Trinity.
Oh, is he? Oh, great.
And he's taking new entrance autumn 2018.
Fantastic.
So he said, keep watching the website.
Yeah, no, that's great news.
Yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes if somebody is a cat o' nine tails and they flay you, you might write another
There's
chapter.
nothing like a deadline.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time.
you.
I know it's another busy day and people are arriving to go out in another boat. So you've been great to come and talk to us.
And thank you so much for yourself and Peter coming down. It's a joy to see you.
We absolutely love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sky morning, mid-spring, and to market a new dead thing, a robin. Somehow, they always find me, crouching in the cavernous ditches and hurling themselves under the wheels of my Fiesta, toppling from the sky to land at my feet. And because my small world is coming apart in tiny increments, it seems fitting that the creatures should be dying too. They're being killed with me. They're being killed for me. I decide I will take a photograph of this robin. The first in a series, perhaps. A series about how everything is being slowly killed.
So we're joined by Martin Malone, who is a poet born in County Durham in the north of England and who currently lives in Aberdeen. I think that's right, isn't it?
Just moved to the Moray coast, a little fishing town.
Gorgeous. And he has published 2 collections, the most recent being Kerr, which was published by Shoestring Press in 2015, and a chapbook called Prodigals was published by the Black Light Engine Room, which is a fantastic name for a publishing collective. So I know at the moment you're working on a PhD, which focuses on Great War poetry. And at last night's reading, you were talking about some of the poems that you've been writing as a response to that. So how are you finding this whole academic overlayering of what you'd be writing anyway, or how is it working?
It's been extremely interesting, really, the dynamic between the academic side, which I wanted to be quite hefty with. I didn't want to just do creative writing and a critical reflection on what I was doing, because you always emerge from that as a genius, surprise, surprise. So I wanted to do something actually stood alone from that. And the transfer of the resources, the research has been fascinating. I've never worked like that before, so that's been interesting. I finished it actually. I'm now Doc.
Oh,
but
congratulations.
Don't call me Doc unless you're going to give me an upgrade on a flight.
Well, I know. I always reckon it's kind of like the glass hammer, the creative writing doctorate, but that's just me and my bitterness. I think.
Yeah, no, I fascinate. I actually kind of am a refuser. I keep saying it's a PhD in poetry because actually, if I weighted it, it was at least 60-40 in favour of the research and academic side. Although a book came out, the finished book is the poetry manuscript. I'm still working on the academic. I think it'll be another 3 or 4 years before I finish that.
And you mentioned last night during the reading that to a certain extent you were kicking back against a lot of received notions about poetry, the Great War.
Yeah, we've had 100 years of it, and I just, it felt to do with permission really. As a non-combatant writing 100 years later, it felt like I didn't want to join the Sad Shires Brigade and just write poems in amethyst about it, the bit of the poppy show that I do kick back against. And I had an imagined reader, which I suppose was a 16-year-old now. I mean, in the UK, as I said last night, it's virtually an act of UK citizenship to have some knowledge of Wilfred Owen. And I'm thinking that's a law of diminishing returns as it recedes in time. So I think I decided to try in my own way, a humble way, reinvent the idiom of Great War poetry for my own purposes. Because I think there's a lot of poetry written in a mode, and I just wanted to disrupt that mode a little bit. And I kind of do it within the collection. There's 2 sequences, a 50-poem prose poem sequence, which just physically refuses to behave like a trench lyric, an elegiac lyric. And then there's a 30-odd poem sequence of the thing I'm dissenting from. Yeah. Because I think it's important to prove you can do both things.
And it just feels spookily coincidental that at the time that you might be engaged in this project, Europe looks like it's trying to recreate itself into the shape of the split, broken up borders, etc., that we saw 100 years ago. I mean, is that finding its way in?
I would have had it otherwise, but it's virtually gifted me a book, the mess we're in. Now a refusal to learn the lessons of history constantly, and the resonances. I mean, you heard last night I read a poem called Brokenshire, which was it's the Irish border situation now that was talked about then. So there's been a lot of once I'd struck upon the means that I thought was going to take me forward. There were just gimmies. I only had to read by the papers, keep my ears open, and go. There's poems in there about the Irish border situation, about Article 50, about gun running, and about how we're all gangsters now. The erosion of collective morality. Really, it was like. Once I discovered it, it was like, I hope no one else hits upon this.
It's mine.
It's mine for now.
Yeah,
So now that I've finished the manuscript, I feel I can ease back on that. It's starting to go out to a few people. So.
Well, can I maybe take you back a little? Because I'm always curious about how people find their way into poetry, because it is such a mad thing to be wanting to do.
It is.
So I'm wondering about how you, growing up in County Durham, like what made you think, oh, that's something I'd like to try?
I think I'm a bit of a monkey see, monkey do type person. I've always, it's been the same with music and everything. If there's something I really like, sports, I'll want to do it. And I think originally I probably came to it in transit in the form of songs between Hartlepool and Liverpool, going to see my dad's family, a big Liverpool Irish family. As a kid in the old A40, my mum and dad, there's no radios and no seatbelts. Now with a 4-year-old, you kind of wonder. And they would sing songs from musicals and Irish songs. Yeah. So I think I got it through song.
Yeah.
And then later, there was a wonderful anthology of dead white guys, but there were good dead white guys. Actually, 4 of them probably weren't dead at the time I was doing it, but called 9 Modern Poets.
Oh, okay.
That was on the GCE syllabus in those days.
Yeah.
So, so I kind of...
Anybody from your neck of the woods?
Opened in wonder. No.
Yeah. Because I'm thinking
No.
of Tony Harrison's kind of reaction to, you know, wanting to hear somebody with his vowel sounds.
Yeah, I think it's a class thing, and that's still quite a big thing with me. I think we've actually gone back in the last 20
Really?
odd years. Yeah, I think since Thatcher there's been an erosion of working class intellectual possibilities and opportunities. I probably wouldn't even be possible now. So to me, being a poetry editor, for example, and doing a poetry PhD, coming from where I come from, is a political act, profoundly political act.
Yeah.
So I get the Harrison thing.
Yeah.
It's only more latterly I've discovered that there were some great Northeast poets around, but you tended to go through the mainstream and come at it like that. Even now, though, I kind of always have felt that if you want to beat the enemy in that score, you've got to sing his song better. So I probably am quite consciously an academic and pagey type poet. My inclinations are that way, even though I come to it via song. Because I think I was possibly put off by the lack of me around and people like me around. So I kind of, like a lot of people, did a literature degree and was going, oh, okay, that's not my
experience
permission.
exactly.
So I just wrote songs and was in a rock and roll band for rock and roll bands for many years. It seemed a bit more democratic.
Yeah.
And it's something that exercises me a lot now, this notion of a democratised culture, a more democratised culture.
So, I mean, what? Because, you know, one of the things that I was wondering about was this, you know, and you alluded to it earlier, the kind of the confusion, the political confusion, the sense of confused identity that we all have. Like, you know, what can poetry and poets do there? Can poetry make anything happen?
Oh goodness, that is. I think you can make it happen for you, and it's like the old thing: you can't be what you can't see. So it's like the old thing with African American rights in America.
Yeah.
You've got to have models that model you being what you are from where you are.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, with the small do things, making things happen, they can.
Yeah.
The last time I think I felt writers were making things happen was probably in the old Czechoslovakia, really, with Havel and people. I think they did make things happen.
But
and that was writers.
I remember I did a workshop once with Adam Zagajewski, and he was talking about, you know, what happens when all of the political questions are sorted for, you know, the writers in the Eastern Bloc, when there isn't anything to, you know, rebel against or be oppressed by or whatever. Like, you know, there's a void suddenly and they're not quite sure what you write about.
I think there's a pause and possibly a culture shock, and then new questions are asked because new situations arise.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not like the old conditions of the Soviet bloc, but we're living in challenging times, interesting times, if we go by the Chinese proverb. And I think what you do is you start asking different questions and modelling different answers. I mean, it was interesting. I worked in Czechoslovakia not long after the Velvet Revolution, and I said to them then, you know that you're going to get a whole different set of problems. The Russians drove across your garden in tanks, but you're about to have your minds driven over by consumerism in a different way.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
That probably, they rightly said, that's easy for you to say.
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah.
But there are different types of problem to be asking the question. Poetry is never going to be short of the question to ask.
And you mentioned also that you're an editor of a magazine, The Interpreter's House. I think it's just published its 66th issue. Is that right?
I've just put to bed 66. It might be there when I get back. The printer proof. Yeah.
So how does the work of being an editor feed into your own practice, do you think?
Yes, good one. To be honest, as conscientiously as possible, I've tried to keep the two career things separate, because I don't know about yourself, but I would never want to feel that my writing has got a leg up as a result of my editing.
Yeah.
So I've tried as much as possible
Yeah.
to keep them separate.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of beneficial effects to reading a lot of poetry. You get your eye in very quickly. You become aware of what is out there.
Yeah.
And it's like anything. If you practice, and reading is, as we say at any workshop,
Yeah.
you know, a good writer is a good reader. So if you're reading a lot, it's bound to have a beneficial effect upon your writing.
And are there trends? You know, what are the trends that you're observing at the moment in terms of what people are writing about, or the style, or?
I think what's happened is that there is a lot of good and sound poetry around now, because poetry now has a lot of courses, and
Yeah.
it's gone to the academy, so you can get, like me, PhDs in it
Yeah.
and MAs in
Yeah.
it, and there are a lot of great workshops.
But is that at the expense of the kind of the mad, untrained genius?
I think it is a little bit. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that. I think what I go on. That said, you do get a lot of good poetry as a result. So the base levels
Yeah.
upped wonderfully. I mean, things like the 52 project, kind of, we got a lot of poems
Yeah.
that I didn't do it, but
Yeah.
my deputy editor had started it, and we
Yeah.
could spot them.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that we didn't get some very good poems
Yeah.
from it. But you could almost spot the ones that had been produced that way too.
Yeah.
That's not a criticism, that's just an observation. But
Yeah.
there's something about the essential, there's a quality of essentialness to some poems that you just fall in love with. You think this poem had to be written. And actually sometimes, as I said a little bit last night at my reading, sometimes writing about a little less about what you know can create a new poetry that isn't about those real core moments and needs for you to write, and that's good too. You get a very different poetry that you wouldn't otherwise write,
Yeah.
and that sometimes comes through. There is a school that I kind of resist, which is the me thinking cleverly out loud school, and I think there's an awful lot of good poetry that's getting into the bigger presses that way,
Yeah.
but it seems to be any kind of consensus and uniformity I'm on my guard against.
Yeah.
And while I'm always impressed by it, it rarely moves me in
Yeah.
the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I totally
Yeah.
get that. Well, we wondered whether you'd read something for us.
Yes, I'll read this for the first time because it was one of the last poems I wrote on the PhD, the
Oh,
Young
terrific.
Returning, and it's actually from the more non-dissenting side of it. It's based. I wanted to do something to do with the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, and that was kind of because it's all very much Western Front from the ground.
Yeah.
Our socio-historical perceptions. So I'll read Wanton Boys, which is based heavily on a wonderful memoir by Cecil Lewis called Sagittarius Rising. So this is Wanton Boys. 17 is not a grateful age, but they'll take you young, overlook your lies for a roaring engine. So you swap those carefree years for the freer sky's New Testament of Nacelle, Pitot, Aero, Magneto. A dream conjecturable as heaven, flight's still fresh miracle paints its brilliance across your days, and earth grows suddenly remote while cirrus turns copper, fades pink, then drifts away grey into night. Tipval, down past Boiselle, round the Fricourt salient and on to Montauban. The earth taking moonlight like moleskin, then home to dinner and the empty chair of a boy you'd laughed with over lunch, lost at 2,000 feet where he worked the arc of our own guns. Summer weather brings days of blue and crystal, heat bumps throwing us up above the haze to circle like flies in an August room, the air our element over the gun's continual scintillation. From here the land is shorn of its contours, and the PBI but dun figures labouring under kit, while we move like spirits in an airy loom. Always in your blind spot, it is chance we fear most. Aberration, tailspin, fire or the unforeseen. You die alone in the clouds, and death, like the sun, is a thing you cannot gaze on too long.
Super. Super. A bit of King Lear, bit of Yeats.
Yes. Yeah. That was definitely from the mood, the tradition side of Great War writing. There was the lyric elegy.
I mean, going back to what you were talking about earlier, just in terms of just the kicking back over this sort of the received opinions about how that war was fought and experienced. In Ireland, I think there's a whole other layer of, a whole group of people, 200,000 of them, fought in the Great War, but couldn't talk about that experience because when they came back, the whole political landscape had changed. So we're only now recovering those stories in Ireland.
It's true.
But that one received sort of image just has been sort of rammed down our throat, I suppose, everywhere.
I think now we've allowed in a few more competing narratives, and actually one of my academic chapters was on Heaney and the Irish soldier poets, and that took 3 times longer than the other 3, simply because Ireland was involved and everything had to be verified, walked around, and there are competing mythologies, obviously, with the North and the Somme for the Unionist tradition, and what it was, as you just described so well, about the South.
And it's only going to get more complicated when we start to try and talk about the Civil War here,
indeed.
And the competing narratives of that one, but that's a whole other thing. So those poems from that project are coming out next year.
Hopefully 2018. I've got a possible 2019 if it's with the publisher I want it to go out with. That would be possibly kicking into 2019.
Yeah.
It could come out sooner, but this is probably, it's my 3rd collection. And I was saying to Geraldine Mitchell, this is one I really quite believe in, and I think the people I'm writing about deserve their audience in this new way if we're going to still remember them in this way. So I'm hoping that it will find a means to hit that audience in a way that small presses, for all they are wonderful, sometimes cannot.
Don't have the reach. Well, I mean, if you come out of the whole academic process of the PhD still with a faith in the creative work, that was the basis of it. That is a huge achievement, I have to say. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you. It's great being here. Thank you.
So thank you to all our guests on this latest special Dromineer Literary Festival episode of the Attic Sessions. In particular, thanks to Martina Evans and Martin Malone, and of course the wonderful Eleanor Hooker, without whom none of this could have happened. And please do join us next month for another episode of the Attic Sessions.
Yes, I know that I'm just a dreamer. I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.